Hey everyone, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and on today's episode I am going to show you guys how I got my engine from the ground to in my engine bay and got my car pretty much fully wrapped up. So you won't want to miss it. Stay tuned for that. Now today's episode is a little bit different than your normal episode because we are going to be getting the engine in the car. And as you can see behind me, the engine's already in the car. I filmed this a little bit differently than I have in the past, and it took a lot of time to get a lot of different pieces of footage for you guys here. And before we dive into the actual installation of this engine and how it all got to where it is right now, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about turbo kits for the Classic Mini. Now before we get into the video of how all of this went in, any pitfalls, and just kind of a breakdown of everything on the engine, I want to talk about the turbo kit that I'm using, why I chose it, and why you guys, or things you may want to consider as you are thinking about turbocharging your Classic Mini. Now in my setup, I have the Bagsport Fabrications full turbo kit. And what that is the exhaust manifold, downpipe, turbo, cold side setup, so your intercooler that goes in the front here, and then the inlet piping and up to your throttle body. Now, that kit is made to accommodate that portion of the build. The other parts of the build, your throttle body, your ignition system, how you're delivering fuel, all of those things are kind of left to you as the user and the person who's installing this. And I think that the Bagsport kit is really the closest to a bolt-on style kit that you can get. However, bolt-on is a really kind of charged word. A lot of people refer to things as bolt-on, and in more modern cars, there are a lot of parts that can literally just be bolted on. On a Classic Mini, no matter what job you're doing, there really isn't a bolt-on part. Almost always you're going to have to fiddle with something, or you're going to have to kind of makeshift or do something to make it work just right. And that's just the nature of the quality of these cars as they went off the production line, which was not super high, and the variance over all of the years with the Classic Mini. So jumping back to the turbo kit, why did I choose this one? Well, this kit is designed with truly the holistic engine build in mind. So Ben over at Bagsport really thinks about the whole engine as your build. Turbo kits, in my opinion, are not something that really is made to just bolt onto a car without any other modifications. Well, at least on a Classic Mini. And adding a turbo to an A-Series engine is asking a lot from it, especially when you consider that it is a, 30-plus year engine. In some cases, some of these are up to 50, 60 years old. They were built as an NA engine, which means the compression ratio on it is made for naturally aspirated. And this is important because when you add a turbo, you're adding boost, and your base compression ratio is kind of the threshold by which it starts to add boost. And with these engines, it is extremely beneficial to decompress these engines. So from the factory, you might have something like 9, 10, and in some cases maybe 11-to-1 compression ratio. And the higher compression ratio will help the turbo spool faster, but it does introduce a lot more heat, and there is a lot of pressure being built up inside this engine. And so when you're doing a turbo build, I don't feel, as someone who's gone through this a few times now, that it's something you can tackle without thinking about the entire engine. What pistons am I using? What rods? Is my gearbox up to the task? What are my drop gears that I'm using? What's the fueling method that I'm using? All of these things have to come together to make a really well-functioning turbo engine. Now, there are a lot of other turbo kits on the market, and there are some that market themselves as a bolt-on kit. So you don't have to do anything to the engine. You just put the turbo on, you put your new carb or your fuel-injected throttle body on there. I think they use specialist components. and you just off to the races. That bypasses a lot of the safety concerns that I have around the bottom end of the engine, and you're just immediately adding boost to it. And from what I've read online and watched some of their videos, they kind of cite that you are running lower boost, so it doesn't matter. And in reality, that's not really the case. I mean, if you have a 10-to-1 ratio in your car and you start adding, 5 PSI to this thing, there's a lot of heat in that. And their kit does not include an intercooler. And in most situations, the turbo that they're using on their kits is woefully undersized. There's a lot of components on there that, in my opinion, just aren't really made to work correctly together. And that is all of that to say why I went with the Bagsport kit. And it's because this is truly something that is thinking about the entire engine build as a whole. So it's built with a GBC20, which is perfect for a 1275. And it's built under the expectation that you are also doing the work you need to the rest of the engine to make sure that it can handle the boost and drive safely and efficiently into the future. Now, I've also seen on some forums that the idea that you're running over 5 PSI on these engines is somehow making it a drag car or something like that. These engines truly do fine with more boost, especially if you build out the bottom end. So, my engine on the dyno last week was about 20 PSI, but that is obviously taking into account the rest of the engine is built to handle it. However, you can run 10, 12 PSI on these engines really, really well as long as you've built out that bottom end. So if you're curious at all about how I built out this engine, I have a video. It's my supercharged engine build that covers the build for the most part about how we're set up today. And that's forged pistons, that's updated gears in the gearbox. There's a lot of components in this that really bring it to a level where it's safer to run those higher levels of boost. So my goal with this video is not to just poo-poo on the Jet Motors kit, but I do think that there are better kits on the market than the one that they're selling. And I think that some of the claims that they're making and some of the guidance they're giving around their engines is a little disingenuous, or in my opinion, it can be dangerous in some situations. So what about this engine? Well, let's jump over into the past. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a rundown on how I have this set up, some of the kind of special componentry I have on this to accommodate the turbo, and how I'm going to get it all in the engine bay. So I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions at all, want to post anything, see something that's really weird or unusual, feel free to post it in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer those questions. But let's jump into the past. All right, so jumping back over to my engine, the last time you saw this, we were starting to assemble it, but I decided to put a pause on it. Now we have most of the things here installed and ready for it to go in. There's just a little bit of mock-up that I need to do before it goes into the engine bay. I'm gonna do that off screen because it's not super exciting. But let's take a minute to show you guys what's going on the front of this engine, because it does have a few things going on. First off, we have our new boost controller with an expertly made bracket here from the Bearded Yorkshireman, RSP Turbo Cooper on Instagram. Thank you so much, Elliot, for putting that together for me. This is mounted directly to the transmission housing here. Then we have a knock sensor mounted on one of the engine steady bolts here. The Bagsport kit uses the back hole for your engine steady that does not use this front one, so we are going to have a knock sensor here. This is one of those things that's super important to have when you're turbocharging an engine. It's going to help you tune it safely and make sure that the engine doesn't explode, doesn't have any debt, and doesn't knock. So that's going to get wired into my Haltech ECU. Then we have the new oil feed off of a banjo bolt here. This is the feed coming out of the oil galley. It'll go through this banjo and up into the turbo. And then we have a dual oil pressure and oil temperature gauge that will be fed into the Haltech ECU. Next up, we have the brackets from Bagsport. This is where the intercooler will sit down in, just right down into those posts. Nice and easy. And of course, connecting all of the pipes up. But you can see, bam, got an intercooler, mounted up, easy peasy. Now jumping over to the other side of the engine, again, this is our bracket that the intercooler mounts on. We have our standard oil return here that's going into my HEL Performance Oil Thermostat sandwich plate. You guys might know already, I do sell these on my store, so if you do want to pick up an oil cooler sandwich plate, this is thermostatic, so it does have a thermostat inside it. The way that it works is oil is flowing through this return down into your filter, and it has a safety in it so that there is always oil flowing through the oil cooler, but it's just a little bit. And as the temperature rises, more oil is allowed to pass through that cooler and into the cooling system. And then as the oil cools back down, it'll shut that, turn off the oil cooler, and make sure your oil temperatures stay steady and reliable. And then finally down here, you guys might have seen on a previous episode, I do have a belt drive set up for my timing system. I have that paired with their little crank position bracket and a small Hall effect sensor here to measure my crank position using the MED pulley system. So that kind of covers the core components that we see on the front of the engine here. All right, let's take a breather here. That was a pretty stressful engine insertion in this car. And it wasn't really because anything went bad. Everything actually went really, really well. It just kind of slid down into place. The lower engine steady mounts, they were fine. Radiator went in, everything cleared. It was just that I think that this has been out of the car for so long that I just had a lot of pent up stress about whether or not this would fit or if I'd run into any issues. But here we are. We've got the engine in the car, and it's really, really exciting. It's a big milestone. Now, this is not the end of the episode. We're going to continue to assemble things on here and get more and more completed. But I did want to show you guys, this is the oil cooler that I showed you guys earlier in the video. And I was talking with Ben, and I thought, you know, what would be really helpful, because this is mounting right down there on the subframe, it's kind of hard to get to those things. What if you put some threaded inserts or some riv nuts on this? So I went ahead and tested this out for them. Worked really well. This fits perfectly down in here. So you just kind of thread it in, fit it in there, and bam. Got yourself an oil cooler. Obviously I need to bolt that in. But I want to put the filter and the thermostat sandwich plate in first. It's going to make my life a little bit easier. And I think I'm going to go ahead and fill those with oil, since I don't want to have to take them on and off. But we're going to start taking stuff off of the engine here, start getting things assembled, connect up some of the hydraulic lines, and hopefully we can get the turbo, downpipe, and that kind of whole side put together today. Maybe even the intercooler. Should be pretty exciting, but let's get to it. All right, so little bit of a jump cut. I know, I'm sorry you guys. So I had a few things that I needed to tweak on this engine, and there was a lot of in and out, and honestly, it was just not very exciting. And then I got a little carried away putting some of this stuff on. So here we go. The engine has been lowered into the car, and we have the turbo kit installed. It's a really straightforward installation process. You guys saw before it cut off how the whole kind of assembly goes in. The best way to do it is really to leave the bolts kind of on the hot side of the turbo, on the manifold and your exhaust just a little bit loose, and then you can lift and shift the whole thing in place, all kind of assembled and together. Now there is a lot going on in here, and let me just disconnect this hose because this is not a permanent hose here, and you guys can get kind of a pretty good look at what the engine is going to look like when it's done. There's not much more that needs to go on here aside from, of course, the intercooler, filter, and the charge pipe going up to the drive-by-wire, which is just loose right now. Now off camera, I did a ton of wiring, and I've said this in my videos in the past, but showing how I terminate a whole bunch of wires and connect a whole bunch of wires is really not exciting at all. I've tried millions of different ways to try and make it interesting, but really it's just a lot of tedious time crimping, stripping, cutting. But let me give you guys an overview of how all the wiring comes together in the Bad Wolf engine bay here. Now, I wanted to spend a lot of time really making this wiring nice because this engine bay deserves to get looked at. It deserves a really nice and thoughtful setup. And so that's what I did. I took my time and ran a brand new wiring harness for the whole engine and the whole car. You guys can refer to my previous videos about that if you haven't seen it. And the way that I ran this is using a couple things. I bought the flying lead harness for the Nexus R3. That is all of the wires pinned out and with flying leads about, I think, 1.5 meters long. And that allowed me to mount my ECU inside the car, and then all of the wires come up through this hole right here in my bulkhead blanking plate, through a little heat shrink tube thing, and then from there I split them out to go to all the various devices in the car. Now with fuel injection, there's a lot of different connections and a lot of different sensors you need, and getting everything set up can be a little confusing. I recently started writing articles on Substack. I have my own Substack for Classic Mini DIY, and I've started a deep dive into EFI for those of you who want to see that. And the way that I have done this here is I have 2 branch circuits. They're tucked up underneath the bulkhead here, or underneath the scuttle panel. Those run to the left and right of the car and into the inner wing. Now I used a type of wire harness cover called Shrink Flex, and then some regular Raychem heat shrink. Now I use this combination because the flex wrap looks kind of classic, and for the parts that are visible inside the car here, namely these wires, this wire, and some of the stuff up front, which I'll show you in a minute, those I wanted to look nice. I wanted them to look kind of intentional, but also not stand out too much. Then once the wire shifts into the inner wing and goes down the side of the wing here, that wire switches to a full Raychem, weatherproof heat shrink. So nothing pretty, just really resilient, because there's going to be a lot of water, debris, things like that getting bumped up into that wire. And I'll show you a little look under the wing here. I haven't pinned up all the wires, but I'll give you a look. Now, both of those circuits run to various different things. Over here, you'll notice my ignition coil is living on the bulkhead here. I really wanted to hide this, and a wonderful viewer sent me a bracket to use down on the front of my engine. Unfortunately, with the oil cooler, intercooler, and all of the different things I needed up there just wasn't a way to fit it. It was unfortunate. I really appreciate them sending that to me, but it's just, with this build, it ended up not working out the way I wanted it to. Now, I am going to be showing you guys in just a minute how to make your own ignition leads. This is some custom line that I got from a wonderful provider here in the US. I'll show you guys that in a little bit, and I posted a link to that in the description. All of the coil wires are going to run along the top side of the wing here, since it's a pretty wire, and it's going to come and connect to all the spark plugs. Then on the other side, we have our injectors. We have the throttle control connection. This is actually controlling the motor for the electronic throttle, the drive-by-wire throttle. This is my lambda sensor, intake air temperature sensor, which will live on the bottom sides of my charge pipe, and then a fuel pressure sensor right over here. Not all of these are required. Some of them are, but not all of them. So if you don't want to run a fuel pressure sensor, you don't have to, but I figure I want to have the data. Then those go into the inner wing, and let's jump up front here. I'm going to show you guys where everything else goes. Now, the main thing I wanted with this is that the whole engine, when everything's in place, looks kind of as naked as it possibly can. EFI does have a tendency to add a bunch of wires and connections and tubes and things, but it doesn't need to be super bad. Unfortunately, there is some stuff that just ends up being visible, but all of the stuff down here is going to be covered up by the front mount intercooler, which I'm going to install in just a minute, but I want to show you guys all of the things that are connected up here. So I have a compact 40 amp alternator here. This is a Denso alternator using a DSN small alternator fitment kit. I'm going to post links to that in my description if you guys want to pick that up. Then I have my boost controller. That is coming off of the circuits on the left side. I have a knock sensor right here. And then I have my oil pressure and oil temperature sensor right here coming off of the block where the original sensor and original feed for the mechanical gauge came from. In addition to that, you'll notice there's an oil feed for the turbo that comes off of that using a banjo fitting. Then as we move down to the bottom here, this is where things start to look a little bit more chaotic. Thankfully, all of this gets covered up by the grill and you wouldn't be able to see it from the top, which is really just my goal, make it look pretty. You'll see there's a long line right here. This is for the oil cooler. This oil cooler is on a small bracket that is made by Ben at Bagsport. This is one of the first ones, and we were kind of prototyping some fitment here. If you were to pick one of these up for you, it's going to be a little bit more finished looking there, but I was prototyping that with him. And you can see it's got a feed and a return for this oil, and that goes into an HEL thermostatic sandwich plate on my filter. There's an inlet and an outlet on that, and that kind of just builds it all into the original filter housing, so you can still use the standard return line here. Then we have our battery and alternator cable coming up here. Coolant temp sensor. This is the connector for my big fog lamps that you guys are used to seeing on my car. I am going to be keeping those. I really like that look, and I think it's going to look good with this green. And then stuffed down here, completely non-visible, I have a vehicle speed sensor, which is coming off the gearbox. It uses the standard gearbox spin-on connection. The ECU receives my speed signal, and that's what it uses to display it on my digital Smith's gauges. And then I have my trigger position sensor, which tells the ECU where the engine is in its rotation. So with all of those, we've got all the wires. That's all the sensors. That's all the funkiness that you guys got to deal with when you're going to EFI. So, pretty exciting stuff. Now, one of the cool things about this Bagsport kit is this intercooler. It makes the process of installing it and taking it out really, really easy and really fluid. So essentially, I can pop this in and out. It doesn't require any bolts. It has 2 posts on the bottom that let it sit down in place. And so when I'm ready to take it out, just go ahead and pop it out, and you'll see this pipe on the bottom here is what we're going to need to feed up into the turbo, or rather the turbo needs to feed into the intercooler. So I'm going to stick one of my hose pipes on the end of the turbo, and then this is going to get kind of snaked in and clamped in place. But briefly, I just want to go over what all is happening in this engine bay. So you'll see I've got my ignition leads all wired up. I'm going to do a separate video on how I made those because these are custom leads. They run up and over to the ignition coil. Then I did a whole bunch of AN pipe work over here. All of this is essentially PTFE AN fittings and hose. This is all rated for ethanol-based fuels, and it makes things much more reliable, and it's a lot easier to work with than your standard AN lines. We have my breathers here. So we have one coming up from the transfer case, and then one coming up from the fuel pump hole on the back here. These two feed into the rocker, and then the excess gas is run out to an inner wing catch can. This rocker is going to serve as the oil separator, but it also, in the event that there is any sort of blow-by or excess that is coming out, it will run out into that catch can, which I can easily drain anytime. We have our fuel pressure regulator right here on the bulkhead. This is getting a feed in return, all goes through the fuel rail into our new Siemens Deca injectors. These are 630cc injectors, and they should be perfect for this application. These are newer injectors. I have not had an opportunity to test those, so this is going to be their kind of maiden voyage, which should be pretty cool to see how they work out. Aside from that, I have already set the base timing on this. If you are curious how that works and what you need to do in order to do that, I would encourage you to watch some of the videos on Haltech. They talk about it and will cover it in a lot more detail than I would. You are setting the base timing, so showing your ECU what top dead center is. So when the sensor is reading at any given point, it's going to know when your engine is at top dead center. The only other thing that we had to verify before we can start this up was that we have oil pressure, and you should be seeing on the screen right now one of the Instagram stories I posted. I posted as soon as we got oil pressure straight up to a happy 85 psi, which is a little high, but it's cold. So I'm going to see how that trends when it gets a little bit warmer, but I'm not too worried about it. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and install all the cold side stuff. I'm going to get that out of the way, and then we'll start cranking this and see if we can get it to run. All right, and with that, the engine is installed. We've got everything reconnected here, and it is time to take the car to the dyno. I'm really excited to see what the power figures end up being. This is something that, with the previous configuration, we made a little over 200 horsepower and 208 foot-pounds of torque. And I'd like to see similar numbers, or at least see higher numbers lower in the RPM band, but that'll have to wait until next episode. Now, before I give you guys the glamour shots of this engine here, I think that it's important to look back at where we came from, where this engine was before we painted the whole car and restored the rest of it, and then kind of give you guys a before and after comparison. So I hope you guys enjoy. If you see anything in there that you have questions about, feel free to. Also, I want to say a big thank you to Bagsport Fabrications for getting me one of the first cold side setups that he has made, in addition to his hot side setup for the GBC Turbo. So if you guys are looking for a turbo kit for your car, make sure to check that out. It's a really, really excellent setup and just really goes into this engine bay so wonderfully. Anyways, I'll let you guys get to the shots, and I will see you on the next one.